Good afternoon, anti-novelists and friends. Welcome to this episode of Zettelkasten for fiction writers, where imagination finds order. So, you'll see you're looking at chaos on my desk, but there's a reason. My colleague, the esteemed Kathleen Spracklin, asked an amazing question, and so I'm going to answer it in this video flow because it is very pertinent to what we've been talking about, which is going from your notes and ideas to some kind of a zero draft where you're starting to identify the order of your story, to then starting a work in progress and rough drafting out those scenes. So what you're looking at is the genesis of my novel, all right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through about 3 years of work of how I went from my initial notes and started turning those into something that started to take the recognizable form of a novel. So jump in and swim with me. Here we go. Lots of handwriting, lots and lots of handwriting. I've got files and files and files of papers, notes, little mini timelines, maps. I mean, you name it. It is all in here. So this is actually where I began my novel, is in this folder that went with me on that very first hunting trip when I started to see if I could actually breathe some life back into my book. One of the first things that I did when I started my Zettelkasten was about the time that I was breathing life back into my novel. I needed some structure, so I went through using Scott Scheper's system of the academic disciplines, and I set up some of the key things that I knew I was going to need for my novel. Like here under the Natural Sciences 3000, I go 3100 is biology and evolution, 3200 is botany, 3300 is human biology and death. Okay, over here under formal sciences, 4100 is pure math, 4200 is applied math, and I've got an arrow, cryptology, because that's important in my book. So from the very beginning, when I started my Zettelkasten, I was already looking at my note box as a vehicle for getting this book written. So everything that I do in my note box, generally, I would say 95% of everything in my note box has direct bearing to the novel that I wrote, okay? So this, in a sideways fashion, answers the question that I got from Jason about, after the book is finished, will I retire my Zettelkasten and start a new one for book 2? What does that look like? Well, no. This book that I'm writing, that I've written, The Conjuring Stitch, will always live in the 7000s. So if I were to spin around and show you my note box, you would see in the 7000s, there is an index card with the title of my novel, and all of my character cards, everything that has bearing on it, lives right there. When I get to book 2, I will simply begin with 8000. And I've already placed a spot holder over here in my note box. I was going to grab it and show you, but it's not coming up and I'm not going to leaf through. But there's already a tab labeled 8000 for book 2 in this series. So that is the short answer, Jason, to your question. I will just continue doing the work because all of the nonfiction reading and research that lives over there in my note box will stay where it lives in the academic disciplines. There's no reason to change anything. And then for book 2, I'll just go on to 8000 if I need it. So that came pretty much first. And then came this. This is a handwritten timeline that starts in 1867 when George Fabian is born. I'm not going to tell you who that is because I don't want to spoil the story for those of you that are reading along in my work group. And it just goes year by year, 1899, 1900, 1911, 1916, and it just goes through key things that happen in the story, okay? So I'm using my color codes so that I can highlight things that have relationships with each other. And this is just a big piece of easel paper that I have folded over in multiple ways, right? So that I can have different parts of the story along different fold lines. So over here, this one starts in 1790, and it goes forward from there up to World War I, okay? So I used this as my first handwritten guideline for what this book was going to look like. This is another version of that. So just another handwritten timeline. Now you'll notice there's X's. So these two timelines are the things that I worked off of when I started digitizing. Okay. So each X represents something that I picked off of here, put over into the digital form so that I had it for safekeeping. This is just me talking to myself on the page about the story. For the next iteration, you will see this. This is a calendar page. If you followed me at all or looked at the other videos that I've done, you know that I like to plot my books in a calendar. Like this is a 2022 recycled calendar. I also often use a recycled happy planner, and I just go through and I change the dates to reflect the dates of my story. So that's what this is. This is just a photocopy of a couple of pages out of that calendar book. And I've just gone through, this is chapter 1, scene 1, chapter 1, scene 2, scene 3, and so forth. So I'm literally just flowing over what that story looks like for myself as I start to figure out how the story moves through time. The next thing that I did, and I have many versions of this, you'll note, this is dated 1/31 of 2020 and it's 8 pages long. This is where I formally started working out my timeline. I've labeled it timeline of events, and it starts in the year 5th to the 15th century. And then I've got 788, 1043 to 1072. Then I've got a prologue. Then I've highlighted 1075 AD, 1300 to 1800. So you can see these are just notes to myself about things that were happening in history that may or may not have bearing on my story. And then you'll see over here, I've started checkboxing and circling items. Okay, so again, I'm just using this as a springboard to get myself into the actual writing of the book. So this one is from 131. Then you'll notice in the next draft, same written document timeline, but this one goes to 2/21 of 22. Okay, so this is where things really started to gel. Okay, I started to think, okay, I've got a good handle on my story. I know how it starts. I know how it ends. And I was really able to sink my teeth into starting to fill in scene by scene, chapter by chapter details. So the next thing that I did, this directly answers Kathleen's question about what the digitization looks like, was this document dated 2/21/22, 7 pages long. And you'll notice down the left-hand side, I have span of time is my first column. Okay. The second column is labeled year. So span of time here. So this one is the 11th century. All right. The next one is the 12th century. And I've just color coded it for myself. But in this year timeline, those very same years, remember I had 788, 1043, and 1072, 880, 1075. So these are just things that either have bearing on the story, so they're historical events or things that I might make reference to, or they're actual pieces of the story. So as we get over here, we've got 1200, 1300, 1400, 1411 is when the Voynich manuscript was likely written or is being written. So that's a critical point in my story because that manuscript is a key point of the story. Now you'll notice I've got this page, and then directly behind it is another page, and it's just labeled plot points. So behind each major tracking page, there's a blank page onto which I can record notes or ideas that have relevance to that page before it. So that is the short answer. Here, again, I've got my column, which tells me 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, things that are happening, right? I've got the exact years here. But then I've got things that are happening in the world or in the story. So that's column 1 is the century, column 2 is the year, column 3 are historical or actual events that have bearing on the book. And then column 4, these are my character things. Like here, I've got a note that Branch's ancestor was involved in this transaction in the 1500s. and I've made myself the question, when and by who? So this is just where I'm talking to myself about the story. And then column 4 is actual story notes, at least in this draft. There's my blank page. Go on to the next one. Okay, so here. Over here, when I get into the 19th century, okay, you'll see I've got in 1854, you will see Gordon Branch is 25 years old. Jane is 24. Those are my main male character, Marshall Branch's parents. So I'm just leaving myself a breadcrumb trail of what those events line up like on a historical timeline. And you can see I'm starting to make myself some notes here. And I'm just, making cross-references and whatnot to myself. But I've always got my century in this first column. I've got year by year in my second column. I've got specific notes here about my story. And then think of this as a flow chart. If this is happening here, then I'm asking myself a question, and maybe I'm giving myself a resource or an answer to the question, or I'm making a comment. This says the library is key. William Voynich acquires it between 1906 and 1914. So those are just story notes to myself. So this one you can see is marked out. It tells me that I have already transferred this over to the newer version. So now we're in 2022. And you can see in this one, I've still got my centuries highlighted in column 1, year by year in column 2, story notes in column 3, and then I've labeled this plot point, characters, and scene. Because by October of 2022, I was really getting dialed into the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the story. So then I've got a note, this was updated 10/21, and here is that update. I've gone ahead and added my color coding key down below, but I always keep my century in column 1, year by year in column 2, my plot points, my characters, my scenes. Now notice I've added another column here, right? This one stopped with scene on the right-hand side. Here, I've added location, okay? So what that is telling me is where are things happening? Because this is where I'm really starting to line up. Okay, if this character is here in this location and this character is over here and I need to get them together, right? You see how I kind of start just working that stuff out. I'm drawing my little plot models, my story models, making myself notes about things and how they relate to each other. Whew, that is some tiny print, but you get the idea, all right? So the next one that came is 10/25. This is just another update of the same kind of thing. However, on this one, I've added a first line and an opening quote column. So as I built the story, I was keeping track of the first line of each chapter because that's just makes sense to me for how to keep track of everything. And I was making checkboxes about each chapter being started with an opening quote. So let's go up here to the very first iteration. This is the very first place where I began that digital process. And you'll see I just hand wrote the dates down the side. And then those got translated over into the actual dates that went on the spreadsheet. And these pages are just pasted on a big piece of poster paper. And this was the first time that I went from just my notes about the story, and I actually started plugging in the years for when things were going to happen chronologically. So from top to bottom of my spreadsheet, the years go down the left-hand side, and the events or the markers go across the top. So this one, you'll notice, has a whole lot more stuff in it, because this one was early on. Excuse me, it was February 20th of 2022. I'm making myself a note about research questions. And then I've got a pink column and I've got a blue column. So I know those are things that have to do with my two main characters. So in this iteration, I needed that little bit of extra information to start to orient and move things around in the sequence of events. So there you have it. The last thing that I did, which is the most recent thing that I've done, and I'm not going to let you look at this for very long. This is my series planner. It begins with book 1. it takes you through to book 2 and goes on through book 3 and etc. and so forth. And it just tracks that key information so that I have all of that at a glance should I need it as I'm doing the writing from book 1 into book 2. So the most recent version that I have is this one from September 18th of 2024. So that was just like about 2 months ago. This is the last time that I really worked on this book. It's got, this is the master, which is just a master list of chapters that allows me to track my chapters. The whole thing is 14 pages long. And then this is a manuscript copy. I want to say this is of the first act, maybe part of the second act of the book, which I was just using to do some proofreading. So this is where all of that ended up. It ended up in a proper chapter list, chapter by chapter, that just prints the whole thing out, because obviously I don't need the dates anymore. I don't need the points of reference, the references back and forth, because it's done. So there you have it. I hope that was helpful, just to allow you to see the genesis of the project, how it evolved from handwriting to handwritten timelines into a digital format so that I could see everything from a high level, and then how ultimately that ended up in a complete printout of just the chapters and their and each chapter's title. So there you have it. Thank you, Kathleen and Jason, for the questions. I am going to put all this stuff away now because I have made a huge mess on my desk, and I'm going to get back to doing the important work, which is writing Zettelkasten for fiction writers for you guys. But this is a good example of when you get your zero draft materials together, you're doing your research, you're creating your note cards, you're starting to generate some of those scenes and ideas, then you're ready to start drafting. You got to track that draft. And so for me, this worked out extremely well. Take what works, leave the rest, and hopefully together we will get your book written, because that's my goal. So take care. Thank you all for your questions and for hanging in here with me. I'm going to put all this stuff away and I'm going to get back to work writing my book for you. See you tomorrow.